Bitter shortage. The introduction of coffee rationing in the United States on November 29, 1942, created a chain of effects that reached beyond the wartime moment and shaped later policies, consumer habits, trade structures, and supply chain systems that remain active in the modern era. A clear timeline shows how a single decision, driven by submarine attacks and limited shipping space, influenced regulations, industry standards, and emergency management approaches used today. 1942 to 1943. Rationing sets the first national model. Coffee rationing began when the Office of Price Administration limited every person older than 15 to 1 pound every 5 weeks. The government introduced the program because the United States needed to conserve shipping capacity after major merchant ship losses. The administrative structure used numbered stamps, purchase regulations, and standardized enforcement. This became one of the first large-scale federal consumer protection systems that combined ration books, retail tracking, and price controls. These methods shaped later federal emergency procedures by creating a tested template for controlled distribution. When coffee rationing ended on July 28, 1943, the program left behind policies for allocation, public communication, and civilian participation that federal agencies kept for future crises. 1946 through 1950s, post-war trade policy learns from ration-era shortages. After the war, U.S. officials used lessons from 1942 to push for more stable trade agreements with Latin American coffee exporters. The United States had relied on Brazil, Colombia, and Central America before the war, and rationing demonstrated how vulnerable the country became when transportation routes faced disruption. Shipping loss statistics and trade flow reports from the early 1940s informed U.S. negotiations in the late 1940s. These discussions supported long-term supply contracts, port infrastructure upgrades, and monitoring systems for cargo movement. Modern U.S. trade security programs trace part of their origin to wartime coffee supply instability, because policymakers used ration-era data to argue for diversified sourcing and protected shipping lanes. 1962 through 1989, international coffee agreements take shape. The experience of rationing helped guide the United States when it joined the International Coffee Agreement in 1962. Although the ICA focused on export quotas and price stabilization rather than rationing, the United States supported the agreement because earlier shortages had shown how quickly consumer markets could destabilize. The ICA used detailed records of production, export levels, and consumption rates. This global framework influenced modern commodity management systems that track supply chains and price movements. The ICA ended in 1989, but the data reporting structures and quota management processes formed the basis of reporting tools now used by international agricultural agencies and trade monitors. 1970s through 1980s, emergency management evolves. Wartime rationing created the first federal example of structured civilian participation in large-scale supply restrictions. In the 1970s and 1980s, federal agencies used these historical procedures while forming modern emergency management guidelines. The coffee program's approach to communication, ration token distribution, and retail compliance became case material for agencies studying how to coordinate the public during shortages. This influence appears in fuel allocation planning, disaster relief inventory systems, and state-level emergency supply protocols. The 1942 to 1943 rationing program demonstrated that controlled distribution could succeed when paired with consistent instructions and direct federal oversight, leading to refined strategies that remain in place today. 1990s retail supply chains modernize. U.S. companies studied wartime records as they built new distribution models for imported goods. Coffee was one of the best documented commodities during the war because federal agencies tracked supply, shipping origin, ship capacity, and consumption rates. Logistics researchers used these records to analyze how shortages developed when transport routes failed. These studies supported the rise of just-in-time systems that monitored supply levels through digital tools. Even though these systems differed from rationing in purpose, they drew on earlier federal logistics analyses. Companies used wartime shipping data to understand the importance of redundancy, supplier diversity, and port capacity forecasting. 2000's Homeland Security and Supply Chain Risk Frameworks. After 2001, federal supply chain risk assessments used historical shipping loss data from the early 1940s to model how quickly a consumer good could become scarce under targeted disruption. Coffee rationing provided a clear example of how a non-essential item transitioned into a restricted commodity when transport routes collapsed. Analysts integrated these cases into modern vulnerability studies, which helped produce standardized risk assessment tools for imported goods. These tools guide port inspections, cargo tracking rules, and emergency resource planning. The cause and effect pattern that appeared in 1942, transport loss leading to consumer shortage, supplied a measurable data set used in modern risk modeling programs. 2010's consumer behavior studies use ration-era data. Researchers examining panic buying, shortage anxiety, and product substitution habits have used records from the coffee rationing period as historical comparison points. The ration program offered detailed weekly consumption patterns, redemption rates, and demand curves. These data sets helped analyze how consumers respond when supply decreases but does not disappear. Modern academic work on resilience, substitution behavior, and consumption pacing cites coffee rationing as one of the clearest examples of predictable civilian adaptation during controlled scarcity. These studies inform modern marketing strategies, retail stock decisions, and supply forecasting programs. 2020 to 2022, global supply disruptions revisited the 1942 lessons. During the pandemic-era supply chain crisis, journalists, economists, and logistics experts pointed to coffee rationing as a historical parallel for modern distribution issues. The 1942 shortage resulted from shipping losses, while modern shortages came from port congestion, container imbalance, and labor disruptions. Analysts used wartime data to compare rates of import decline, consumer substitution patterns, and retail stability. The comparison helped explain why supply chain resilience required diversified shipping routes, coordinated communication, and targeted allocation strategies, elements first tested in 1942. The example also resurfaced in federal reports on supply chain security, which used the rationing period to illustrate how external shocks could reach consumer goods quickly. Present day, legacy in policy, trade, and culture. The event continues to influence modern systems. Federal emergency management guidelines still reflect lessons learned from ration stamp distribution, retailer compliance monitoring, and supply allocation methods. International coffee trade relies on reporting structures shaped in part by post-war and ICA-era reforms that emerged because rationing exposed supply weaknesses. Consumer behavior studies continue to use ration-era data to understand how people adjust consumption when availability changes. Supply chain analysts still reference wartime shipping records when modeling risk because the 1942 to 1943 coffee shortage remains one of the clearest examples of how transportation constraints map directly onto consumer markets. The event stands as a documented case showing how a simple commodity can illuminate larger systems that remain central in the modern era. For enthusiasts of historical ephemera, visit history-collectors.com to find collectibles that might complement your collection. You can own a piece of history.